Really excited to be here today. Um, this this topic is really near and dear to me as a dissertation coaching consultant. I find at almost any stage of where a writer is, and this is true of just peer-reviewed journal articles as well, since they sort of follow the same format as a dissertation. You still have to have a gap and a problem and a purpose and a question, line up some type of framework, and everything has to come together, including the research design. There's this idea of logical linear alignment. And I think that's a conceptual term that if we integrate that in, we'll see it. And as Jessica was pointing out, it comes down a lot to language, the lexicon. Just changing one word basically has a systemic effect over everything. And one little word change in the problem, purpose, or question can mean that you have to go back and change everything. So you change one word in the question, you have to go change that word in the purpose and the problem, and maybe other places. So if you can get the logical alignment together, you will see that the study comes together in a much tighter way and allows you to really do the hard work of what you really want to get to, which is collecting and analyzing your data and answering the research questions. All right, I'm going to run my slide full screen now and go ahead and jump in. I'm going to try to stop at about 145 or 150 or so. So we actually have a few minutes to answer anything. I have actually 50 slides to get through. So I'm going to go through pretty quick. And so that way you can write down your questions sort of as we go. I have a little activity at the end if we have time as well. Okay, let me go ahead and I'm going to jump into my slides for some structure now. So, welcome. This is going to be about mastering logical or linear alignment. And I say that word master because mastering anything is like a lifetime of something, right? So it's always coming to the practice. I'm a dissertation coaching consultant here at the Dissertation Coach. And as you can see right there on the left-hand side of the screen, there's an example of logical linear alignment. Gap. It's kind of like a waterfall effect. Gap. And it's a very organic process. Gap becomes problem. Problem becomes purpose. Purpose becomes questions. Questions get tied to a specific framework, which then leads to organically to the type of methodology to address those questions and framework, which then leads to, depending on the nature of the research questions, which design is most appropriate. And we have to be cautious of not to say it, perfect. There's no such thing as perfect alignment of a research design, but the research questions will indicate something that may be appropriate. So if they're open-ended questions, that would point to qualitative. If they're more measurable types of questions, that would point to quantitative. And then how are you going to collect and analyze the data as part of that design? So everything needs to line up. So by the end of this webinar, hopefully you'll be able to identify a gap, develop a precise problem statement. From that, write the purpose, write the questions, select a framework, choose an appropriate methodology and design, and overall ensure coherence in your academic work. Here's an example of logical linear alignment, but just in a different way than I was showing. On the prior slide, I was showing top down. This shows the same thing, but you could see it as bottom up. And I think this is honestly a better way to conceptualize logical linear alignment because the gap is the foundation. So there's the foundation. From that foundation comes the problem, then purpose, then questions, then theory, then methodology, then design, then how you're going to collect and analyze. Here's another way to sort of conceptualize it, this as a funnel. So you have all this literature coming into the big side of this funnel. Then it narrows to a problem statement. Then it narrows to a purpose. Then it narrows to the questions, narrows to theory, narrows to method, and then narrows to how you're going to collect and analyze data. So almost notice you're almost in a constraint. So once you have that gap and problem, you're very constrained and you're inside of that funnel. And the point is to get narrow so that you can somehow contribute to human knowledge through your hard efforts and research as a scholar. We don't get to solve usually gigantic problems. We solve little pieces of the puzzle that then become part of the greater whole. So why does it matter? So if you don't have logical alignment, you're going to notice that your sections don't really feel that connected. You're not going to, the methodology may be off. Particularly with committees, they'll really delay you moving forward until you really get the logic of that problem, purpose, questions, theoretical framework, and research design all aligned. It just delays the ultimate work of actually solving research problems if we fail alignment. So if you do achieve alignment, then you have research that's cohesive. It's also much easier to defend because it makes it much easier for you to understand. And if it's easier for you to understand, that's going to be easy for others to understand. So what is it? So you'll see me reiterate some of these things over and over for the sake of consistency. And the whole idea is begin with that gap, grow the problem, let it trickle to purpose, questions, theory, and design. I think it's helpful to basically see the dissertation as one big argument rather than a bunch of things and things that may be disconnected and not tied together. Your dissertation really is not a collection of chapters. It's it's a sustained academic argument. And in a way, it's a test of being a human being. Human beings aren't necessarily really naturally, sometimes very logical or consistent. In fact, humans are rather unpredictable in their nature. The dissertation is a test of how you actually take something and follow it through and take that golden thread of the problem statement and then weave it into a tapestry all the way through and never lose sight of it. It's a challenge, is what it is. It's a challenge in logical, linear alignment and the ability to follow through with something from the beginning to the end without getting lost. So think of it as just your whole dissertation is nothing more than one sustained argument. There's a gap. This gap creates the problem. This problem creates the purpose. This purpose creates the question. This framework puts a boundary on the study. So once you put that framework in, and a framework isn't something that sits inert over here. It's not pretty. It's not ornate. It's not an ornament. It provides the entire boundary of which you're looking at your research. You could see it as a lens. But I like to explain it as a coaching consultant to my writers as a framework because it's much easier to conceptualize that rather than a lens. What a frame does, if you look at a piece of art on the wall, is it brings the image to the foreground. This is why we don't hang paintings up in our living rooms that don't have frames. It doesn't look professional and it doesn't bring things into the foreground. It doesn't frame what it is that you want somebody to perceive or see. Then finally, it's the method. We have to look really carefully at the research questions to align that method. And many times the questions themselves will point So if you have research questions that are open-ended, like how or what or why, you know you're moving towards a qualitative methodology. If you have questions that are going to examine and measure and compare and use deductive logic, then the questions are very different. So the questions lead us to the method, not always to the research design, because the research design is even more specific and narrow. But the questions usually will at least lead to your methodology. So now let's take a moment, and I've divided the slides up into some sections. Now we're just going to focus right now on identifying a meaningful research gap. Primarily, this is going to come from peer-reviewed journals. In some cases, you may be able to use a limited amount of gray literature or people's theses and dissertations, but primarily your committee will be looking for something coming from peer-reviewed evidence in the journals because they want to train you to be able to do that, to become a scholar so you become a contributor to human knowledge. Where I typically send my writers when I start working with them. And even when I start working with writers in their chapters 3 or 4 or 5, I find that there's sometimes misalignment issues that we need to deal with before things are clear. And so one of the best places to look for research gaps is just the future research sections of the articles that come from the journals. This is the fastest way to get a study off the ground of any type, regardless of whether it's a dissertation or an article that you want to target for a peer-reviewed journal. In other words, save yourself a little time, read the abstract, quickly look at maybe some problem purposing questions, but don't spend hours looking at the results. Go down to the discussion section of the article, find the little section on the discussion and future research directions, and somebody will point you straight to a gap. They're basically just handing you a study, and all you have to do is accept the baton and start running. That's the quickest way to narrow. Often recommend looking at meta-analysis as well because they give us the state of the literature for a particular problem or topic. This is exactly what's happened with the research on learning styles. And the American Psychological Association in 2019 was very clear when they published the article that learning styles, a belief in them, may be detrimental to human learning, the way the theory predicts. That's because once the meta-analysis started coming out, aggregating all of the literature on whether or not the focus on learning styles was creating learning, there wasn't much there. So meta-analysis and critical reviews of the literature are great ways to sort of get some focus and say, okay, what's going on in this topic in my field? Another great gap source is conflict, controversy. That's the whole purpose of science, is to deal with issues that are not easy to understand, to not run from conflict, but instead move towards conflict and tension. Another great source is just social issues. And some institutions like Walden, for example, in the United States, um, they force their writers to address a social problem before they can actually state the specific problem, because they want to ensure that their graduates are actually making some type of positive impact on their community or society in some way. So some institutions force you to first develop the gap as a social problem before you even move into the specific research problem level. So here's an example of a weak gap. More research is needed on teacher leadership. Notice what that lacks is specificity compared to this. Limited research explores how culturally responsive leadership influences STEM engagement among Black middle school students in charter schools, which may have a negative impact on learning. That's the kind of specificity you need when you're referring to a gap. And a gap, it's not good enough just to say something is missing in the literature. Yes, that's an academic problem. That's a problem for PhDs and scholars. But what's the actual problem? Like in this case, the actual problem is teachers and students, learning may be impacted in a negative way. That's the problem. So there's actually two parts to a well-written problem statement. One, it needs to be something that needs further work. And two, you need to actually explain what the problem is. So specificity creates rigor. So let's look at this gap. We know all this stuff. So and so has researched this and found this using this method, and so used this method with this population to look at this, and we found this. But here's what they neglected. That's the gap. So I often get questions like, well, I don't know really how to start my study because there's no literature on it, so I don't know what to do. That's the whole point. But the only way to prove a gap is to show what already exists. The only way to talk about negative is to talk about the positive. The only way to even perceive a gap is to talk about what's already there. So then we have to go to the literature to see what's there. What is remaining unclear about what other researchers have already done around this topic? Maybe who is being underrepresented, or what context is missing. So if you can't answer these questions really clear, then you're probably in need of refining your literature review. And when I'm teaching my writers to arrive at their gap and problem statement, I guide them to a funnel approach to the literature review, starting with the conceptual or theoretical framework to create a boundary right from the beginning, then the general topics leading down to the specific topics that then that will eventually become the specific problem. And if you end your literature review with the gap, that makes a natural transition to chapter 3, which is what you're going to do about that gap. So where your chapter 2 ends, your chapter 1 now begins, because you've taken us on a journey through the literature down to something very specific that needs to be addressed, or is controversial, or is unclear, or is something that's underrepresented, or populations that may be underrepresented. Could be contexts and environments that are missing. So where that literature review ends, chapter 1 begins. And now you can take that gap to the top of chapter 1 and then derive the problem statement from that gap. So now let's make a transition from gap to problem statement. So what is a problem statement? It basically translates the gap into something that's very narrow and focused so that you understand exactly how you are going to contribute to knowledge in the area. I typically tell my dissertation writers that I'm working with as their coach and consultant that the researchers that you name in the gap are your future colleagues. So I want to stop for a second so we can just process what that means. Those researchers in that gap, you're basically saying these are the individuals that have done work that comes before mine. Now I'm going to create something that locks in to what they're doing. so that after I finish this study, we can now get together as a community of practice and continue to go deeper into this and publish together. So really what the authors of the gap are not these sort of people on the side. They're actually core individuals of which you will hopefully have professional academic relationships with to continue working in this knowledge area. So the problem statement basically identifies who is affected. It explains sometimes why the issue matters, what's missing. It sort of anchors everything down. So we move from this information gap to a very focused issue that we can now start addressing. So this is sort of just a generic structure. Although we know this, little is known about this, particularly among this population in this context, resulting in typically something. The way you word a problem statement is sort of negative because you don't want to word the problem as a solution because it's not really a problem then. So typically a problem is written sort of as a deficiency, or here are the issues. There's a lot of common problem statement errors. For example, a lot of times novice researchers will create problem statements that are just too broad or too vague. And the problem with that, particularly at the dissertation level, is this is a student paper. And your job is to show that you can follow through with research and do what you've been trained. If the problem is too vague or broad, you may end up doing 2 or 3 dissertations and doing much more than you need to get out of school. It's about getting to the finish line as a student so that that way you can build your work and do all the things that will eventually some of them become your magnus opus. Typically the dissertation is not the magnus opus of your career and work. It feels like it because of the pressure around it, but that's just a reaction to it. It's a research paper. And it's a research paper to be able to show that you understand how to do research and you can follow through with something and you can do what you were trained to do. And the committee's there to guide you along the way and help and support you. I see a lot of times problem statements not really supported by literature or supported by literature that's really old. When I'm working with my writers, I try to get them to ground their problem statements in literature no older than 3 years. That way, if a committee member says, well, this is it seems like an old problem. If you're using current literature around the research gap, you're showing that it's not an old problem because it's clearly a current problem. And that's what you want to do for a dissertation, is to ensure that you're addressing a current problem in your field. Other issues that come up are like, not the problem isn't really aligned with the purpose, and then the problem isn't aligned with the questions, and then the problem isn't really aligned, like what the problem is when you look at your methodology. Does that methodology really even make sense, or is that method misaligned with the issue? So notice that problem is like, it's the golden thread. It's going to be just woven into every single thing from chapter 1 and through the final chapters of the dissertation. It just follows you. So here's the way to sort of check for alignment. Does your problem directly emerge from the gap? Okay. Does it clearly identify a population or context? Does it state an actual researchable issue? If not, you need to revise before moving forward, because you don't want to jump to the purpose or jump to the questions or jump to the methodology until this problem statement is absolutely narrowed and you can write it in one sentence. So sometimes inside of certain committees require maybe a page or two of writing in the problem statement section, but eventually you have to arrive at just one sentence. And the heading, it says it all, problem statement. Didn't say problem paragraphs, problem statement. So eventually, all that writing in the problem statement section of a dissertation still has to end with one sentence. Then that one sentence can become the purpose. So, how about crafting a strong purpose statement? So now we've moved out of the gap. We have a specific problem. Now we need to align a purpose. So what is a purpose statement? Basically explains what you're going to do about that problem. Typically the who, the what, the where, sometimes the when, and quite often the how. In other words, what your study will do to address that problem, how you will do it, methodology, who, if it's a social science type topic, who are the people or the population. Basically, it clarifies the intent, but it is in direct response to the problem. So intent, population, methodology, leading to actions. So now the purpose points us to actions about what we're going to do about that problem. So here's a formula for sort of a generic formula for a purpose statement. The purpose of this, and when you're writing this, you have to be really looking at that problem statement. In fact, what I typically do is have my writers copy and paste the problem statement into the purpose. That way the words don't change. And then change the wording of the purpose to match exactly the words of the problem. So the purpose of this quantitative study will be to examine these variables among this population using this design guided by this framework. Now you fill in the blanks. So we might want to distinguish between qualitative versus a quantitative purpose. So this kind of comes down to the choice of verbs. So in qualitative studies, you want to see verbiage like explore, understand, describe, interpret. And then in quantitative purposes, you'll use words like examine, measure, test, predict. So just like Jessica was saying at the beginning of this meeting, words matter. The lexicon matters. And just one word can literally change an entire study. So the power of words. So here's another alignment check you can take yourself through. Does your purpose directly address the problem? Does it use the same language? Does it match up and align with the design? Does it reflect your methodology in some way? And in a way, you really don't even know this yet until you finish writing the problem, purpose, and questions. And then the question will naturally point to the methodology. So if your purpose says explore, you're not going to be doing an experimental design. And if your purpose says examine or measure, you're probably not going to be conducting interviews and looking for human perceptions. Once we have a solid purpose statement that's tightly aligned using the same terminology with among the problem and purpose, we have to do the same for the questions. No difference. What I usually have my writers do is I'll have them copy and paste their purpose statement into the research question section and then start trying to play with that purpose statement until they get at least one central question. Now, if it ends up being qualitative, you may end up with several specific sub questions that are highly specific to that central question. Or in a quantitative study, that central question may become several different hypotheses. But you should be able to arrive, if you've narrowed this gap enough to a problem, you should be able to at least ask one central core question by just using the language of the purpose statement, just turning the purpose statement into an interrogative. So it opens the door to what comes next, which would then be aligning the methodology and the theoretical or conceptual framework with the question. The questions guide everything. And I sometimes work with writers that are sort of overwhelmed. And what I typically find is that their research questions may be too big. They may be taking on too much, particularly as a student to get out of school. You don't have to put yourself on the map as a student or do a great thing. You have to show yourself and your committee that you can handle a large scale research project and follow through from beginning to end. And if your questions end up being too big, you're taking on too much, all it's really going to do is delay your graduation. The research questions guide everything, and they point to your methods, they point to the analysis, they shape everything. It's like this is the scope of the study. So sometimes I'm working with writers that may be really deep into even some of their results, and the results just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when we start looking at it, that's because of the nature of the questions. It's driving the scope. And sometimes I also see a lot of writers that I work with doing more than they need to do in their data collection, because all you have to do is answer the questions. That's it. We don't need more. Once the problem, purpose, and questions are all locked together and aligned, these questions are controlling the entire scope. There's no need to get more data, or because you had a thought during the night and wish you had asked this, let's start asking this too. It won't be usable in the study because it was never approved by the committee. The scope is now controlled. That's all you have to do. Answer the questions. And sometimes the chapter 4 results is nothing more than copying and paste the questions and putting the results underneath each one. What makes really clear questions? Well, assuring that the questions align with the purpose and that the purpose aligns with the problem, being very clear and specific. So if you take your purpose statement and copy and paste it and then turn the purpose statement into a question, it's going to be clear and specific and feasible, and it's going to directly apply to your research. So let's think about qualitative type questions. Notice the emphasis on how and what. And in some methodologies, in some research designs like exploratory case studies, you can also have why questions. But why questions can be very circular, sort of like running on a hamster wheel. I'm always very cautious about why questions, the central qualitative questions, but they are sort of required, at least from Yin's perspective, for exploratory case studies. But primarily, I recommend using how and what questions when you're writing qualitative research questions. Notice what this does. It uses inductive logic, not deductive. In a way, theory is very on the side in qualitative research. Instead, it's inductive. You start with the perceptions and voices of participants through interviews or observations or archival data. And then, based on that specific evidence, you see where it points to. So it goes from specific to broad. And then that's the opposite in quantitative, which is highly deductive. You begin with a broad theory and then narrow it to specific measurable hypotheses and variables. So quantitative questions may look at relationships. So if your research question have the word relationship in it, I might think that you're doing a multiple regression or a correlational study. Or if it says, does this predict this? That may say, oh, you want to predict. That's what we do with regression analysis. Or is there a statistically significant difference between something? So the way you write questions and the words that you use really do matter. They have meaning that brings meaning to your study. It guides you.
Well, Chris, I'm just going to add to that because I think you mentioned something extremely important when you start talking about research questions and methodology and design. Is yes, the research questions drive the line of inquiry. I think a common pitfall that students fall into is maybe they've just come out of their qual or their quant class and they're like really drawn to a certain design. Like, oh, I loved phenomenology. And then
Yes.
they try to take their research interest and sort of retrofit it into that research design. And sometimes that works out, but I think it makes it more difficult. I think certain people are drawn to certain types of questions depending on the disciplinary norms. I know that when I started out in healthcare, I tended to ask quantitative questions because that's kind of how I was trained. But then once I had some additional training, I really now start asking qualitative questions. And so this goes back to understanding paradigms, positivist, post-positivist, constructivist, interpretivist. And so generally it's like paying attention to the types of questions you ask and really trying to allow that to drive the line of inquiry. Because if you are asking a certain question, then it likely falls into one of these camps, qual or quant, and then there's a research design that's appropriate for it. And so I just challenge you to not get too attached to a specific methodology or design based on what comes easier or what piques your interest, and really step back and think about what do you truly want to know, and then where does that take you? And if it's somewhere outside of your comfort area, if you think you're a quant person or you're scared of statistics, I just want to say that part of this is supposed to stretch you and be a bit uncomfortable. So don't let that scare you. Try to allow yourself to just think about what do you want to know, and then how does that unfold into an aligned methodology and design.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because I will say that as a dissertation coach and consultant, um, typically, particularly at the beginning of a study, I often address writers that have already decided I'm horrible at statistics. I'm just going to do exploratory because I don't understand. And my response usually is the the research design and methodology is not your choice. It's chosen by the questions. The questions choose it for you. You don't get to choose the methodology and try to retrofit your whole study because of, like you said, your maybe comfort with something. The whole purpose of becoming a scholar is to challenge ourselves and to be transformed by the education process in becoming a scholar, which is not going to always be fun, easy, or comfortable.
Yeah, like I'll just give an anecdotal example. One of the first studies I worked on after I got my master's degree was a really large project, and it started out with a lot of quantitative questions. We were naturally asking questions about the effectiveness of an intervention.
Hmm.
But then once we got into the intervention, certain things weren't working and we needed to understand why. And then it was a qualitative approach. So having that real life experience of actually tackling problems that were happening in a grant helped me see that clarity around why we need to lean towards certain designs based on what problem we're trying to solve. Initially,
Yeah.
the problem was, is this intervention effective? But then when it was sometimes effective and not others, we wanted to know why, and then we needed a qualitative approach. But when you're a student and you're learning, it can be really hard to differentiate that. So sometimes you need to like pause and stop getting sort of distracted by shiny things in the literature and really reconnect with what do you want to know and write that down, and that will lead the way to what type of
Yeah.
study you're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jessica. Now we can do another alignment check here. So as in relation to our conversation we were just having, now can the methodology actually answer these questions? So the research questions are going to naturally begin to point in an organic way. You don't have to force it. And then do my questions actually reflect the purpose? And if it's quantitative, are the variables, or if qualitative, is the phenomena sort of clear in the questions in some way? So now we arrive at theoretical framework. And so the frame, now there's a boundary, there's a frame. And quantitative studies, theories often explain relationships between things that you're going to need to measure. Or in qualitative, it may be more of a conceptual frame that just sort of provides sort of a boundary of a set of concepts that may be aligned with the questions in some way. But now the questions have an opportunity to point to the theoretical framework as well in a very natural way. It's not, I want to emphasize that a theoretical or conceptual framework is not a decoration. It's not decorative. It's not just sitting on the side inert. It's at its core something that either provides a boundary or even starts explaining relationships or phenomena in some way that you're exploring and investigating. This gives you more glue when once you have results to sort of glue your results into things that are already existing in the way we come to know what we know about various topics in our fields. So how do you select a framework? Well, one, look at your problem, look at the questions, look at the purpose, and does the framework in some way help you interpret your findings? In other words, when you finally get data, is it going to help you explain what you found in any way? And if it's not really connected to it, then you probably haven't aligned a framework yet that really aligns with the questions and purpose. So if you're studying motivation, motivation theory, leadership, a leadership theory, identity, an identity theory. So the framework just logically supports the focus of the study. So when you're aligning, does your framework explain maybe key constructs or variables? Does it inform the research questions in some way to help the reader make sense out of those questions? May it,
Kristen,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to piggyback again because
Yeah.
I was just having a meeting with a client about their framework, and I saw something click with her, and so I thought I'd share it here because
Oh,
people,
please.
people really struggle with theory.
Yeah.
And so there's all over the news right now is these GLP-1 drugs for weight loss. And so I used this example and it clicked with her. And it was like, if you are studying weight loss, but you're studying it through the lens of longevity, does this lead to a longer lifespan and a quality of life? That would be one sort of lens to look at weight loss through. Someone else studying weight loss might look at it through a hormonal lens, like how does it change your cortisol hormones?
Yes.
Someone else might be looking at weight loss through the lens of psychology. What are the mental effects of weight loss? Someone in psychology studying relationships might look at how weight loss in one partner impacts the relationship. And so there's a million different ways that you could study weight loss. It depends on your discipline, your field of study, and what your interests are. And so you have to, a framework is what you use to explain that. So, someone from the longevity lens, that camp, they would explain weight loss through this lens of how it extends life. But that is a completely different framing than someone explaining weight loss and how it impacts relationships. And so that theoretical lens is so important. It really does situate your study within a very specific lens, and it brings everything together. It's going to help you explain the results in a way that aren't so generalized that they don't really work for anyone, and ultimately, I think people just struggle, but I think this idea of just you're using it to explain like how you're thinking about the problem. And that weight loss example, I think, is a great one because we all understand what these GLP-1 drugs are, and we all conceptually understand what weight loss is. So,
Yeah. And I think you brought up something that's really important, Jessica, and that's alignment of your dissertation to your field. I can't tell you how many dissertation writers I've worked with that they pick a framework, but they're in the field of education, but they pick a leadership framework. And I warn them, your committee is going to have an issue with this.
Mhm.
And you don't have the credibility to do a study in another field because you've been trained in this field. So
Yes.
unless it's an interdisciplinary type program, there's really no gray area for choosing frameworks and topics outside of our fields.
Yeah, and even in line with that, you have frameworks at like the community level, the organizational level, the individual level. So yeah, if you're in an organizational leadership program, you're likely looking at frameworks at the organizational level where you're
Yes,
looking at
correct.
systems and groups of people. But if you're in psychology, you might be looking at frameworks that are really for individuals. And so yes, there are norms within your discipline that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but in a way, all this does is make writing the dissertation much easier because you have a boundary, you have constraints, and constraints provide humans with ingenuity and the ability to problem solve and be creative. Sometimes when things are too big and broad, it's like we don't even know where to go. So these constraints imposed on us by the problem statement, purpose, and questions by our field, it's really helping us to get inside and get narrow. So we're not like all over the place. Now, naturally, questions theory leads to having to choose a methodology and research design. So typically that might be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. Mixed opens up a whole new can of worms, though. It's a whole new thing because now you may have to have a quant and a qual problem, and maybe even a quant and qual purpose, and you may have quant and qual questions all in the same study. So for simplicity, I think it's easier to just, for the purpose of this webinar, to think about quant and qual and just alignment, because mix makes it even a little more complex for alignment. But then it's not enough just to say I'm doing a qual or quant study. We have to then look at the specific designs. And so if you're trying to capture lived experiences and sort of the internal world of human consciousness, maybe phenomenology. Or if you know you're going to have a lot of data, maybe you have three different points of data like observations and a questionnaire and maybe you want to do some interviews, a case study, so you can triangulate it. A case study is really neither quant or qual. It's always about the bounded case. You can have multiple types of data. Or if you're looking at relationships and your questions point to relationships, correlational. Or if your research questions point to comparisons, an experiment. Or maybe you just want to get a one-shot idea about something, a survey. So if you're going to explore lived experience, phenomenology, bounded systems, case, relationships, correlations, cause and effect, experimental. So if you really look at your research questions carefully, the research methodology and design will naturally start emerging. Then the data collection needs to align. So if it's qualitative, maybe we'll have some interviews. If it's quantitative, maybe we'll have some surveys or psychometric scales that have to be completed. Maybe you need observations, qualitative. Maybe you can look at archival data sets. Your research question looks at data that's already there. But I warn you to not collect data that doesn't answer your research questions. I see this a lot. And that's because dissertation writers are very passionate and they're excited to get into their fields and everything they see they want to take it on. Oh, I can do that. I can do that. But you don't want to get yourself too thin. Just answer the questions, get done with the study, get out of school, and then move on and do the great work that you're going to do. So, a few misalignment mistakes. The problem is exploratory, yet you're trying to propose an experimental design, right? It doesn't really work. Questions are qualitative, but your method is quantitative. Or maybe the framework has nothing to do with any of the variables of your study. Or maybe your findings don't actually answer the research questions themselves. So we have to then go back to alignment and make sure the questions are aligned with the purpose, and the purpose aligned with the problem, and the problem is aligned with the gap. And it always starts with the gap. Or I would say it starts with the gap as the foundation and starts moving up from that foundation. So if you want to ensure overall coherence, gap, problem, purpose, questions, framework, methodology, just make sure each element logically follows the previous one. It's like a thread, like I was explaining. Can I clearly explain how each section connects? So if a committee member asks why, you should have a logical answer at every single level. Like, how'd you get this purpose statement? Well, I took that from the problem. How'd you get this problem? Oh, I took that from the gap. So it's a thread test. And if you can explain how each one of these sections is threaded together, you're going to be great. You'll have you and your advisor or committee chair will get along great and have a lot to start really doing. There's also this idea of sort of reverse engineering. You could start with questions and then move backwards to the purpose and problem, but I've always found a lot of problems with this. Because if you start with the questions, you don't have a purpose yet. If you start with the questions, what if the questions you're asking don't really have any don't really have any alignment with what's actually in the literature? You're not going to be able to even take your study and put it into the body of knowledge. There's no links. So to me, it's not a great idea to begin with methodology, begin with questions. You've got to really start with gap and problem.
Well, it's a bit of a catch-22, right, Chris? It's like a lot of students start writing chapter one because it's the first chapter, and then they go back and
Yep.
heavily revise it because they learned so much in the lit review. And so I just want to keep and help folks keep in mind that this isn't linear, it's iterative. So you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So, maybe your interest, you frame it in terms of a question, but then you go in the literature and you realize, oh, this question has already been answered. But in these future research directions, this is a question I could maybe answer. And so you start with some level of interest, which you might word as a question, but ultimately that is naturally going to shift as you dive into the literature and learn about what's already known.
It's so true. And you know what you just said, Jessica, uh, it makes me think about the diversity of that various higher education institutions force their writers to write the chapters
Yeah. Yeah.
because some institutions require that they write chapter two first. Like, no, you are not writing chapter one until you write that literature review and show me the gap, show me the narrowness of the issue. But oftentimes, students are just allowed to just begin and they have no idea where to do that. It's
Mhm.
like if you just begin at chapter one and then you're forced to already jump down to the gap and jump down to the problem, you still have to do a literature review.
Yeah, and it's going to change. And I tell students who have to go through that, I'm like, listen, I'm just going to help you manage your expectations. Even though this chapter one is quote unquote approved,
Hmm.
it could very well change once you do your lit review. But yeah, my preference is to do the lit review first, and I have the students start with just a rough problem statement. I want them to tell me what they think the problem is so I can help them understand what the literature review needs to do for them to really explore whether or not this is a problem or if they need to narrow. But oftentimes the final problem statement looks nothing like that initial draft. You have to start somewhere, but setting up managing expectations is such a big part of this. And really a chapter isn't done until you graduate. So
That's true. Yeah, to your point, a dissertation is an iterative process, not a product to achieve.
I mean, I have students who are about to defend and they're updating their lit review again to make it better align with their discussion chapter. And they're like, oh gosh, I thought I was never going to see the lit review again. I was like, nope, you haven't graduated yet.
Yeah, get ready. You're
Yeah,
not done.
you're not done till you're done.
Yeah, after my final defense, one of the questions brought up by a committee member actually forced me to do 2 weeks more of work because he insisted that I took my data and build some type of visual model from it. So
Mm-hmm.
now I've got to go back, and he goes, I want it in the lit review and I want it in your discussion. So that took another 2 weeks of work.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
not done, even when I was done.
Yeah. So set those expectations now. You are likely going to return to all of these chapters at some point.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a checklist for you. So the problem emerge from the literature? Does the purpose address the problem? Do the questions reflect the purpose? Does the framework explain the phenomena or variables? Does the method try to answer the actual questions? Do they align? And does the research design actually support the methodology? So you can kind of use that 6-step process as sort of a checklist. So here's just a little case, right? Limited research on X and Y. Problem, we don't really know a lot about X and Y. You know what we're going to do? We're going to explore X and Y. Why qualitative in this case? Well, because we don't know anything hardly about this topic. And for topics we don't know anything about, you have to start somewhere. So you start with qualitative. So, how do these individuals describe this, and what conceptual frame sort of provides a framework for this and a boundary? And I'm going to need to use some interviews, and this is going to end up being a case study. So that way your study is aligned and defensible. So I don't think we have time for this. I was going to take a couple minutes to see if you could write a problem, purpose, and question. But we're kind of coming to the end of our meeting and our webinar. So I want to skip that, and I want to give you a little more like advanced insight. How does alignment signal rigor? So here's what committees look for: consistency, conceptual clarity. Is the methodology appropriate for the questions? And remember that the problem statement is like one statement that you're coherently weaving through the entire study. So that alignment really demonstrates doctoral level thinking, your ability to take a very complex, controversial, or missing stuff that's missing and follow it all the way through without getting lost, without getting so frustrated that you give up. It's you have to have a lot of resiliency as well. And you know, and that's what I love to see as a coaching consultant that works with dissertation writers, is I love seeing the pure potentiality of my writers and seeing their confidence grow as writers. It's what really, that's why I love doing this work. So, a few key takeaways I hope you're taking is that logical alignment is going to strengthen the overall credibility of your study. It's going to make it easier for you to understand. It's going to make it easier to explain it. It's going to get you through the proposal process quicker. It's going to reduce revision cycles, which means less work, and hopefully increase your confidence as well. So, it should feel inevitable. In other words, when you get something really narrowed down, it's like, oh, I've got to do this. This is a real issue. I'm dealing with this. So each section is like, okay, I've got this, but now what comes next? So each thing, starting from gap to problem to purpose to question, needs to really logically align very strong so that you have a very clear and defensible proposal. This is my email, and this is the TDC website. And I just want to thank you for attending today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. If you want to work with Chris Deason, feel free to reach out directly. We will share this presentation along with the recording. I also dropped a link to our website contact us page in the chat. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation to talk about your needs, really to make sure that we're a good fit, that we have someone on the team who's a good fit with you, and also that your timeline is reasonable. So feel free to schedule a free consult with us if you're struggling with any or all of the things that Dr. Deason discussed today. Thank you, Dr. Deason. This is
Yeah,
wonderful.
Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
have a good day.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.